We're going to look now at early Renaissance painting. The first part of our study of early Renaissance painting will center on what we'll call the twin Tommasos. Now, as sculpture of the early Quattrocento was dominated by Donatello and architecture by Brunelleschi, so too was painting dominated by one man, and that man's name was Masaccio. Masaccio died in 1428 at a very early age, and it would not be until mid-century that another master would stand at the head of the class in painting. In order to appreciate the significance of Masaccio's work, we must consider the popular style of the day that Masaccio's work succeeds, and that style was the International style. We look now at the work of Gentili De Fabriano, and Gentili's Strozzi altarpiece is thought to represent the culmination of the International Gothic style, started in large part by Simone Martini nearly 100 years past. While Gentili sought to give his creation a gorgeous, colorful, detailed, and decorative surface, he was aware of the new emphasis of art based on observation. Fantastic poses, strong modeling, and foreshortening of the figures are important aspects of this central panel. Now, of particular interest and innovation are the three Pradilla scenes located below the main panel that you see at the very bottom of this slide. Let's look now at a detail of one of those Pradilla scenes. This is Gentili De Fabriano's Nativity Scene, and Gentili abandons abstract backgrounds in favor of real sky effects of atmosphere and light such as we see here. Now, the three light sources, two of which are supernatural, are the first example of the source of illumination within a picture, and are treated in such a natural way here that they're quite believable. Now, Gentili also assimilates aspects of Ambrogio Lorenzetti's treatment of landscape space into his works. These Pradilla scenes were possibly areas he felt more comfortable in experimenting with, as opposed to the central panel that was commissioned by the richest man in Italy, Palla Strozzi. As we have no record before 1408 of Gentili, it's often suggested that his birth date of 1370 may be as much as 20 years too early. We move now into our study of the twin Tommasos, Masaccio and Masolino. They're not twins, it just sounds fun that way. The styles of Masaccio and Masolino were radically different from that of their contemporary Gentili De Fabriano. Now, while in some ways Masolino had ties to the International style, his work aligns itself much more closely to that of Masaccio. In fact, therein lies a problem, and the possible reason for his exclusion from several textbooks. What we're looking at here is one of Masaccio's Madonna and Child paintings. Now, the presumed relationship of Masaccio's being the student of Masolino often suggested is contradicted by 2 points that we will examine. Masaccio joined one of the Florentine art guilds in 1422, 1 year earlier than Masolino, who was born in 1383 or 18 years prior to Masaccio, and joining a guild was the first step towards setting up your own practice. And a second reason that we don't really buy the argument that they're teacher and student is the fact that they collaborated on a number of works. This confused the issue visually to the historical detriment of Masolino. Now, they were rather different men. Both Masaccio and Masolino are nicknames for Tommaso. Masolino, the older, translates as Little Tom. Masaccio translates into ugly or sloppy Tom. Vasari wrote that Masaccio devoted all his mind and thoughts to art and paid little attention to himself. He refused to give any time to worldly cares and possessions, even to the way he dressed. Perhaps with Masaccio, we see the genesis of the vision of the artist as a compulsive genius. The strengths of each painter are seen in comparing works of a similar nature of unquestioned authenticity. First up is Masaccio's Expulsion from Paradise, which reveals Masaccio's strength in his ability to portray the individual's reaction to the impact of a great spiritual event. The abrupt nature of the modeling here is harsh, and space takes on an active role. Note the violent foreshortening of the angel. Now, Masaccio's style and paint handling contribute greatly to the drama and the tension in this scene. You look at the detail on the right, and the expression in those faces tells the whole story. Contrast that to its sister painting from the same chapel, the Brancacci Chapel, and you see the different style of Masolino now on the right. In Masolino's work, the figures are softly modeled, and the surfaces of the flesh appear soft. The faces are gently described. Masolino here still holds some elements of Gentili De Fabriano's work, as the space is much shallower, and the faces are gentle, almost emotionless, with Eve unaware of the trouble that she would soon get into. It might be argued that the different scenes here required different treatment. No doubt each artist could have handled the other's theme. However, it's thought that they apportioned these subjects in their collaboration according to their talents and interests. Here now we see some overall views of the Brancacci Chapel. Look at the top left, and you'll see Masaccio's Expulsion from Paradise. And then the top center is the painting entitled The Tribute Money that we're going to look at in just a moment. The bottom right shows another painting called St. Peter Healing with His Shadow that we'll look at a little bit later on. You might pay particular attention to the color in these details, as it's far more accurate than the other views that I'm going to show you. Here in this second view of the Brancacci Chapel, if you look at the top right, you'll see Masolino's temptation of Adam and Eve. An examination now of the painting called The Tribute Money shows how easily the two men worked together. Keeping in mind their styles and knowledge of working methods, we can see how they work closely together without egos clashing. The group of figures here do indeed illustrate Vasari's comment that Masaccio made his figures stand upon their feet. Look back at the floating nature of Masolino's figures to see Masaccio's hand in virtually every area of this painting. This shows his heretofore unparalleled understanding of the use of light to create space and model forms. In Masaccio's work, light is first. Masaccio's strength also lay in his using one-point perspective to focus our attention on the main subject of this painting. That main subject is Christ. All of the converging orthogonal lines from the building at the right extend to a vanishing point that's located on Christ's head. Now, Masaccio also organized his work around a central group of figures from which scenes of lesser importance are placed to the sides. This recalls the work of Giotto. Masolino's healing of the cripple and raising of Tabitha from that same Brancacci Chapel reveal Masolino to have a lesser ability in terms of tying scenes together. His figures are not organized around a central scene of importance. Note the two walking figures in the center. They exist only to tie the two parts together. Masaccio's strength lay in his using perspective to heighten drama, while Mussolino's employment of perspective solely for the joy of creating space causes him narrative problems to be solved with these two figures that we see in this detail in Mussolino's continuous narration. Here's one more detail from Mussolino's painting, and it's kind of fun the way you see laundry hanging out the window and the different architectural views that he employs here. As we return to the tribute money, I don't want to raise the idea that by far Masaccio is the man. A re-examination of the tribute money gives us an excellent example of their collaboration within a piece as opposed to within a chapel. What we're looking at here in this black and white view is a breakdown of the Giornata of this painting. Giornata means the day's work in the fresco technique. Again, this is true fresco such as we saw with Giotto's work. And each one of the numbered sections here represents a day's work for Masaccio. Now, it's known that Masaccio worked from the outside in, and most people believe that the central face of Christ was the last thing painted. Christ's face, the most important here, is of a more gentle nature than that of his almost surly apostles. Now, whose style was gentler? Mussolino's. Masaccio was a man so secure with himself and his talents that he had Mussolino paint the last and most important head of Christ, as Mussolino's style better suited the understated and gentle countenance of Christ. The feeling that Christ is by Mussolino is not the wild hypothesis of one scholar gone mad. It is one acknowledged by many now, with few detractors. Mussolino bridges the gap between the international style and Masaccio and makes major contributions to the new art of Masaccio. Masaccio also uses to great effect the device known as aerial or atmospheric perspective. Contrast the clarity of the foreground figures with that of St. Peter to the left and the mountains in the distance. The outlines are less distinct and the colors far less intense in the distance. In collaboration with his use of one-point perspective, Masaccio creates a unified and deep space or stage for his figures in the tribute money. We now look at Masaccio's Holy Trinity fresco, nearly 23 feet in height. Brunelleschi's principles of linear perspective and classical architecture, as seen in the description of the barrel vault, are clearly the influence for this work. Some suggest that Masaccio was working under Brunelleschi's direction, while others suggest that Masaccio and Donatello were in on the creation of the perspective system with Brunelleschi. Regardless, linear perspective creates a logical, rational space whose dimensions have been calculated to house Masaccio's naturally formed figures. Masaccio's new natural method of describing space opened new subjects to his work. This is St. Peter healing with his shadow, and this was a rarely depicted subject before cast shadows became part of artists' repertoires. The recession in space is countered by the incredibly powerful image of St. Peter gazing past the sick as he heals and right through us, the viewers. Masaccio was a painter of raw, intense emotion, equaled by few in intensity and strength. When I look at this painting, I just feel that St. Peter is looking right through me. Now, rather than colliding, the rational and the sensual join forces in his work, equaled by few in intensity and strength. An interesting sidelight in this detail. The bearded fellow that we see to the left here, in the blue, short stonecutter smock, is thought to represent Donatello, while the young man that you can see in the previous slide looking out at us is thought to be Masaccio himself. One last piece by Masaccio that I'd like you to see is the Crucifixion of St Peter, where he insists that he be crucified upside down so as not to relate too strongly to Christ and his crucifixion. Dynamic composition here, nevertheless. The new science of perspective was one which Alberti recommended that artists should take on with all due solemnity. And as we look at more early Quattrocento painters, we're going to see that they're not always quite so solemn. No doubt Paolo Uccello was fascinated with this new science, as we see in his chalice. There's little doubt that he did not approach it with the prescribed reverence of Alberti. In fact, Uccello almost treats perspective like a game. One marvelous quote of Uccello's followed his refusal to follow his wife into the bedchamber, saying, "What a sweet mistress is this perspective." Uccello lived a long life, from 1397 to 1475, yet he made precious few paintings, no major altarpieces or fresco cycles. One of his major works, the Battle of San Romano, that we see here, betrays his early training in the international style, as the densely painted scene recalls the work of Gentili De Fabriano. Uccello's obsession with perspective moves this work away from the international style, as many objects and figures are placed in the landscape as a means of Uccello's showing off his mastery of the new science. Now, even the distant background is divided in such a way as to echo the converging orthogonal lines that litter the foreground. One poor soldier in this painting even suffers the misfortune of dying in perspective. Based on this image, you can see why Uccello was a particular favorite of the Cubist painters Picasso and Braque. The lesser artist from this time that I want to look at is Andrea del Castagno, and he was notable for two works. One was a series of famous men and women, such as his David that was painted on an ornamental leather shield. And here we see his Last Supper. And this painting is conspicuous for a couple of negative reasons. One, it shows how limiting that blindly following the new perspective system could be in a lesser artist's work. And it can also be used to demonstrate the tremendous achievement of Leonardo da Vinci's treatment of the same motif. Here now we have the work of Domenico Veneziano, and Veneziano's work also suggests the international style in his early training coupled with an understanding of perspective. Most striking here is his brilliant use of color, which strengthens the formal separation of space by architectural units. Domenico was born and trained in Venice, and this has been suggested as a reason for his magnificent sense of color, which would influence Florentine artists to come. And with this slide, we'll conclude our look at part one of early Renaissance painting.